Recording in progress.
Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Adam Smith.
Hello.
And Elliot Morgan.
Good evening. Well, good morning, or whenever you're listening to this.
Well, hopefully lots of people are listening to it on the way to Research Ed National Conference or our annual pilgrimage.
Yeah.
And it's great to have you both here, guys. We're going to explore the many announcements made by Ofsted and sort of related parties this week. But first, Adam, what you reading for?
Hey, what you reading for?
This week I read a great blog by, I'm pretty sure the person chooses to remain anonymous. They're just called South Gloucestershire Head, called Where Have All the Head Teachers Gone? And it was really good. So I've just started a course called East 100, which is kind of looking out for people who at some point eventually in the distant future will want to be heads. And this article really hit home in terms of making head teaching, being a head teacher, something that is like an end in itself, that's a prestigious job, that's kind of a pillar of the community, without the need for people to move on to big trust roles really quickly. I think that's been a big trend in the last few years, that people kind of become a head teacher for a few years and then move on to consultancy or CEO or deputy CEO, whatever it is. So yeah, it's really good. It's really kind of worth a read. Definitely. It's called Where Have All the Head Teachers Gone? Elliot, what are you reading for?
So I also read that blog. It was a great blog, so I also recommend that. I have just finished reading Test Enhanced Learning by Christian Still, a book to sort of distilling his expert knowledge on retrieval practice, the testing effect, and sort of everything linked to that. And it sort of really highlighted to me, I've got a fair amount of knowledge on those things, but you simply cannot be an expert in everything. And reading his book really demonstrated to me how just incredibly well read he is around that area. And I highly recommend reading it. He also did a TDAPE episode a while ago, which is great. And I highly recommend going back and listening to that as well. What about you, Kieran? What are you reading for?
Yeah, Christian's great. He and Ben Ebden came and talked to me about test enhanced learning and what it's like in the classroom. You know, always got a really good, here's the research, here's the application. And I haven't read that blog you've read, Adam, but I have definitely seen lots of people saying really, really wonderful things about it. So I'm definitely going to check it out when I've got some space, maybe on the train this weekend. I have been reading a reasonably short blog called Researching How Children Remember. And it's by someone called Nick Flint. And they say, Morgs, that you inspired this. And I don't know if it was a comment you made or if you perhaps were just encouraging people to write blogs, but they said that Morgs Edu, so I'm assuming that's Edward Morgs that we know, inspired them to write their first blog. And it was about confidence with multiple choice questions, which obviously I'm very interested in. And it's well worth checking out and also very, very succinct, if that makes sense.
Love a succinct blog.
Yeah, 500 words or less they should be, I reckon.
Yeah.
Is that what you aim for?
No, that is just completely arbitrary number. I do try and keep them to like a maximum of like a couple minutes reading time though.
Yeah, that's what I like about is it Medium? It tells you like 6 minute read, you know. I think I'll give this 6 minutes.
Yeah, so I find Nick's blog on Blue Sky, which I think we've all migrated to.
I posted just the sort of same thing that was like, you know, come see my talk at Research Ed. By the way, come see my talk at Research Ed. Is session 1, going to be talking about the Norwich Writing Project and making improvement in Key Stage 2 writing across the whole city of Norwich and what we've done in the last year. But I posted that on Twitter, X, and I posted it on Blue Sky. And obviously I've got 10% of the number of followers on Blue Sky, and I do on Twitter, and got like much more engagement on Blue Sky from people that I like and respect. So yeah, I'm down. I haven't looked at Twitter all week. It's all just you know, when they try and get your attention by saying you've got like 20 notifications, but they're all just other people's tweets that you don't really want to read. So yeah.
The little purple star things.
Yeah.
Oh, nope, not interested. Yeah, I mean, I'd actually deleted the app from my phone 2 or 3 days before the sort of blue sky migration began. And I was actually planning on not using social media again. I was like, okay, this is my chance. And now, seeing so many teachers, and I'm trying to follow as many teachers as possible, and sort of interesting and new voices, it's the Godfather Part 3. Just when I thought it was out, they pulled me back in. But this does seem like a much healthier place to find people talking about education as opposed to the stuff we were sort of exposed to.
Yeah, I echo that. Come join Blue Sky, join the Tadape crew on there. We're still posting blogs.
I mean, I think a lot of people joined Twitter because of the conversations we were having about Twitter on here. Because I've definitely seen people say, "Oh, I made an account because of conversation on Tadape." So I almost feel some sort of responsibility helping them off on the lifeboats.
Well, yeah, Blue Sky hasn't quite been tainted by anything yet, so it is still a great little bubble to just read like about evidence-informed practice. People having great discussions, just generally good discourse.
Sunday night, before a new term begins. Well, for lots of people, a new term was beginning on Monday, wasn't it? All of a sudden, a bombshell drops. Graded titles, is that what they're called? Will be disappearing.
Single word judgments.
My first instinct was this shows just how much goodwill there is for the new government. Can you imagine if the last government had announced something on the Sunday night, the last Sunday night of term, when everyone had planned their inset and was ready to go back, and head teachers just sort of gearing up for the year? How people would have been absolutely raging. So obviously, it's probably a good thing. There's clearly a lot of goodwill for Bridget and what she's doing.
Yeah, it's a learning experience. She knew, I think whoever was responsible for the announcement, and whatever went wrong, there needs to be a post-mortem to make sure.
Well, it was, as we know, it was embargoed until a certain time. So
so all of a sudden, head teachers around the country, teachers around the country were then chatting into the early hours of the morning, and then was it on the Monday or the next day? 12 almost key changes were announced too. I've got Thursday, the 5th of September on the article in front of me, but it feels like that's today as opposed to, and this happened a couple of days ago.
Yeah. It's been a bit drip fed this week, hasn't it? Something new every day. They're not going to do this. They're not going to do that. They've announced these new external reference groups today. Some good folks on them. Some people who maybe quite surprising thought they weren't going to be so involved in education with a change of government, but seem to be in there, be quite influential. So yeah, I think it's we're going to talk through it and see what the good, bad, and probably not so much ugly is. But
yeah, excellent. Yeah, because it inspired a lot of chat from us, and I thought, well, actually, this is something well worth capturing. And I suppose probably makes sense to begin with what really jumps out at you. So, Adam, which proposed change most appeals to you?
Yeah, I saw this in the question. I think I'm a bit ambivalent towards the whole thing, really. I think that on paper, like for context, so I'm at a school at the moment where we are anticipating, or we have been anticipating Ofsted for a few terms, and they will almost certainly come autumn, spring this year, hopefully autumn. So, this is something that we discussed at Inset in quite a lot of detail. Now, we're pretty confident, hopefully, that things will go well and we'll get a good outcome. But what the people who benefit, I think, the most from this getting rid of the headline grades are going to be those schools who get good, requires improvement, good, or outstanding, good, outstanding. So where they're one or two elements away from that headline grade that they want. There's a school shall remain nameless. I used to go past on my commute who had a big banner outside that was quote from their Ofsted report, nice quote from the Ofsted report. And then it was that segment at the top where it was I'm pretty sure I'm right in saying it was management and leadership good, quality of education good, early years good, and that was it. And you're like, oh, I wonder what they got for behavior and culture. It turns out obviously it was RI, and they were RI overall. So it's those kind of schools that are on the borderline that are going to benefit, because ultimately you're still getting the same wording. They're still using those 4 terms. You're still going to be able to look at an Ofsted report. It's going to be exactly the same format. I guess, sorry, I've gone completely off the topic of the question, which was what appeals to me most, which is probably just the Monday thing, knowing that we'll get the call on the Monday and it'll be a Tuesday, Wednesday instruction. Not for me in particular, but for my head, who I think that's going to take some of the pressure off for her. And she'll be able to concentrate on the week ahead and not be stressing out halfway through the week, wondering if Ofsted are going to call. So,
no, I think, I mean, feel free to go off piste, because, I've only got a rough outline of what I think this chat's going to do, but school reputation takes a long time to change. And so, yeah, I think there is a limbo that a lot of these schools are going to find themselves in. And I think you had a 2.5 hour commute, Adam, so it could be hundreds of schools that could potentially be referring to that you drive past on the train.
Yeah,
I think it's the, I mean, Adam's pointed out the sort of 2 that stick out to me as well. And I think ambivalent's a good word. I think I'm positive yet skeptical, because it's what this actually all comes to in reality that matters most. I guess one other one that I saw that seemed quite positive is the idea that they're going to work with government to introduce annual safeguarding reviews, which I think is something that I've spoken to many teachers and leaders about many times over the years. Just as I have the single word judgment, and I think an unintended consequence of the single word judgment in the past is that schools were almost pitted against one another, just like sort of league table results. Outstanding became like a badge of honor, while RI became this sort of proverbial stick to beat schools with. And the double RI, they're getting rid of that as well, aren't they? The double RI, and then the thing that they only introduced in like a couple of years ago. As Adam said, even though there's still like those gradings of those 4 areas, moving away from that single word judgment, I think, is indicative that Ofsted are listening to the profession or listening to the parents, because their big listen found that only a third of schools or providers supported the judgment, and 50% of parents wanted it removed entirely. So that change is probably the one that appeals most to me, because it signifies that Ofsted are listening and things are changing as a result. But then the call on Monday is obviously huge as well, because again, demonstrating that Ofsted have this awareness that schools do find inspections rather anxiety inducing. And I don't think that anxiety will go away for a long time, if at all ever. But this is certainly a step in the right direction.
Yeah, I think it potentially makes life easier for inspectors too, because they're going to be away from home 2 days a week then, rather than potentially 4 weeks at a time. And I'm not entirely sure how they structured it, but I think there were a lot of late nights writing reports while on visits to different places.
Yeah, did they not? I think one of the articles I read had said like they do the call on Monday, they'd inspect the school Tuesday, Wednesday, like writing up the report on the Thursday, and then on Friday they'd attend training. Which is interesting.
They have some very, I probably can't talk in too much detail about it, but they have some strange working practices in terms of like the window they have for writing up their notes and writing their report. So I've been told, if you've got an inspector in your room and you think they're not really paying attention, they're just writing notes on their laptop, it's because they only have until a certain point in the evening, and then it's like locked down. You can't, and their quality control is almost, again, like based on sort of anecdotal, but it's sort of instantaneous. Like they're being kind of, who watches the Watchmen? Well, apparently someone very closely whilst they're doing their work. I don't know that actually being an Ofsted inspector is a particularly appealing job. I remember speaking to a colleague a while back who'd just come back from a week in, or like 3 nights in a Premier Inn in Milton Keynes, and the week before there were 3 nights in a Premier Inn in Crawley, and the week before they were out in a Premier Inn in Padstow, and it's like, well, doesn't really appeal.
What appeals most to me is that annual safeguarding, because that almost paves the way for the dissolution of Ofsted, because that's the thing that can't go, really. And we're talking about our sort of feelings about this. This is a reasonably positive spin on an organization that's gone through a reasonably difficult time recently. And there was a separate report published this week, which wasn't very, I don't know if flattering is the right word, but it suggested there were some serious issues at the core. And so I think having that embedded and people being used to, that kind of approach to safeguarding may then allow for alternative systems to be developed over time. Because it felt a bit like the announcement was a bit. I think death rattle was the first thing that came into my mind, but obviously it remains to be seen what will actually happen. Which proposed changes could have the biggest impact on the working lives of teachers, Elliot?
These reforms generally seem to be sort of indicating a more supportive, more transparent inspection process. But as we all know, having gone through inspections, there's always a complexity to what this looks like in schools and sort of unintended consequences. The one that I think about most with this question is the inclusion element that they've talked about as like the new criterion on this report card. And I think that could potentially have quite a significant impact on workload, depending on how Ofsted communicate it and how schools interpret it. Because there's often been a blurring of the lines between those two things. And Ofsted has said they want to look at like evidence-based reviews of pupil premium as part of it. But the burning question for me is how will inclusivity be measured? How do you quantify something that's unquantifiable? Does it become like a tick box exercise rather than actually meaningful inclusion? Because we don't want it to be this sort of compliance driven approach where schools are like trying to meet these minimum requirements. We want them to genuinely improve inclusivity in their and inclusion in their schools. So we don't want these sort of superficial short-term measures. We want sustainable change. And it's a very agreeable standpoint that they've said like schools should be held accountable essentially for how they support disadvantaged and vulnerable children. Absolutely agreeable. But if that leads to sort of increased documentation, vague rubrics, more like data collection, people having to evidence inclusion on lesson plans, et cetera, then I think that could potentially lead to an increase or have the biggest impact on the working lives of teachers. I mean, we've sort of slowly shifted away from the outcome-based task differentiation over the last few years to being some more support-based. But could something like that creep back in a bit? And then I guess the biggest concern about that is like, what does it look like for schools who already have significant numbers of disadvantaged and vulnerable students? Do they face additional pressure and scrutiny with that? We don't want any schools to sort of be unfairly judged by the cohorts that they have. And if they were to end up being consistently rated lower for inclusion or whatever it may be, then it may make it harder for them to attract parents and pupils, and then funding declines, and then we're in this sort of vicious downward spiral.
For me, I think I was going to say the inclusion element of it as well. I am quite excited, maybe is the wrong word, but I'm quite intrigued by a move towards inclusion being part of what Ofsted is mentoring. One of the reasons is that I think that there is a lot of room for improvement in a lot of schools in terms of how pupils with additional needs or pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds, how they are brought into our education system more fully. I feel like a fair portion of my job, particularly at this time of year, is focused on thinking about those things. But then it is something that just gets, you quite often end the year with children in a very similar place to where you began, unless you're making really conscious effort. So it'll be really interesting for me to see whether pressure from Ofsted, as it has with the curriculum, because I think before the last framework, arguably, because we've seen the improvement, there was a lot of room for improvement on curriculum, right? So things have shifted, I would say, very positively on curriculum in primary, particularly over the last 5 or 6 years. We have seen really big improvements from the focus. We've seen things like Elliot, the primary knowledge curriculum. We've seen things like Oak for good or ill. We've seen lots of development in primary curriculum. So obviously it was, someone identified that curriculum was here and there was all this potential for improvement. So if we identify that current practice on inclusion is here, then there's all this room for improvement with inclusion. I don't think that we're doing the best we can on inclusion. I don't think we're getting the best results. I think, today I was thinking about the proportion of children getting to the expected standard in year 6, and there's I would say it's kind of a narrative that you hear a lot, having moved from London to Norfolk, is that if we're meeting the national average, then we're doing fine. If we're hitting that, whatever it is, or 60 or something percent of kids getting to the expected standard, then that's great, and we can now focus on something else, like children getting great depth or whatever it is. And I don't believe that. I don't agree with that at all. I think it should be 85, 90%, depending on the cohort, reaching the expected standard. And once you've got there, you can comfortably start to address other things. And a lot of that is inclusion. A lot of what I loved about my previous school that I worked at was this mindset that every child who enters in reception, unless they have really, truly, genuinely profound learning needs, can meet the expected standard, irregardless of pupil premium or SEND or whatever it is. Because again, and that was seen in their results. You can go and look at that school and see that they get 95, sometimes 100, sometimes 85% expected standard each year, and other things follow from that. They had very good great depth results as well. So there's a mindset shift that hopefully Ofsted will be part of, that kind of raising expectations on inclusion.
My interpretation of the expected standard is that it's a fair sort of, it's an attainable target.
I would say it's an age appropriate standard. Don't think there's anything in there that like intrinsically an 11-year-old is incapable, that 90% of 11-year-olds are cognitively incapable of understanding.
So yes, I'm totally with you on that. I mean, this week, as part of my prep for my talk, I was reading about people with Down syndrome and countless studies. And the one thing that really came out in the sort of studies that have been conducted over the last maybe 5 or 6 decades is that even if pupils have got a diagnosed profound need, that doesn't necessarily exclude them from being able to learn well. So there's even this additional layer of complexity where, because they were talking about counting and research into counting, and no two groups of children in these studies presented in the same way. And so, yeah, I think there, almost like a mindset shift is potentially needed if we're to sort of get pupils to where we want them to get. I don't know. Have I taken it totally off track?
No, it's fine, because that hopefully is what lies behind Ofsted's thinking on this as well. There's a quote here, Martin Oliver talking about, and I have to say everything I've read has been on Schools Week, because every TES article is behind a completely impenetrable paywall. So I'm sorry if there's been some amazing writing and journalism about Ofsted on TES, but I haven't been able to read any of it. So Martin Oliver's talking about local schools for local children, which is a little bit League of Gentlemen. But I think, this idea that children, in an ideal world, children with SEND should be able to attend their local school and receive a high quality education in the same way that a child without SEND is able to do. And I know there's a lot of discussion about actually a lot of pressure in schools would be relieved by additional AP places and things like that. But, if we want to actually do a bit of utopian thinking for a while, I think local schools should have that capacity rather than it being kind of an external thing.
Are there any unforeseen consequences hiding among the proposed changes, Adam?
Yeah, there's the big one for me. I spent a lot of last year working with a school that the trust took over after it had been it received a termination notice because it was found to be inadequate. And it's a school that has struggled with its reputation over the years. Having an inadequate judgment has not helped with any element of that, recruitment, retention of pupils or staff. And, on the whole, I have to say the Ofsted report did highlight some things there, that termination notice was probably the right move for that school. In fact, just talking from our trust point of view, like I feel like we're turning things around there. So arguably, in terms of what we offer to the children, like it was the right. It has resulted in a good consequence ultimately because things are improving. Now, ever since I started at that school, every member of staff that I talk to who's having a bit of a downer, I talk about imagining whether we're going to use a drone or whether we're going to get someone up on the school roof when we get all the kids out on the playground to form the word good. right? That's what we should be picturing. We're going to picture the front of the Eastern Daily Press with our playground and the word "good" spelled out by children in our like pristine new uniform. You know, how are we going to do it? How many kids are we going to need? Like, what are we going to have a party? Are we going to all go to the pub after that Ofsted inspection? That sense of relief at getting that one word judgment, it has been personally like kind of driving me through a little bit. And obviously one of the unseen consequences is if they probably won't get, because of the change in the school, they probably won't get an inspection this year, so they'll probably get a new style report card inspection, in which case we won't be able to do all that kind of publicity, which I know is a bit crass anyway. I'm not being entirely serious about it, but we won't get to entirely scrap that inadequate judgment because we won't be able to just replace it with another simplistic one word, yeah, now we're good. We were inadequate, now we're good. And so there's probably not a huge number of schools because there just aren't masses of schools with inadequate judgments. But there will be schools in that current kind of cycle of what's the word I'm looking for, of improvement, who won't get quite the result, quite the catharsis from Ofsted that they're looking for, which is not a good enough reason to not make the policy changes they're making. I just think it is a bit of an unforeseen downer for that school in particular.
I mean, Lord knows that the EDN needs some positive education news.
No.
Would you propose some sort of staggered transition? Would you think that would solve it?
Well, I think what I would say, and it might even be the case, is that, we weirdly have this dual kind of judgment where they're both inadequate and in special measures. So I think there should be a really formal letter from Ofsted that accompanies any kind of report card style report that just clearly states this school is no longer in special measures or this school is no longer inadequate, just so we can get rid of that judgment. Whatever the report card says, we just need something really clear, crystal clear, that we can communicate to parents and stakeholders and children and staff and the press and say X school is no longer inadequate. That judgment no longer applies. And hopefully we'll get something like that, because I don't actually know if they're making any major changes to the special measures. I don't even know if that's an official term. I don't really understand, but I haven't heard anyone talk about special measures changing. So
I mean, there was definitely chat about how schools that needed intensive support would continue to receive it.
I hate to think that there are inadequate schools out there that weren't getting intensive support. I guess it depends on the trust or the local authority, but the idea that you would be in a trust and have a school that was found to be inadequate, because if I'm perfectly honest with you, one of the reasons why I'm not an abolitionist is because when I read those inadequate reports, they're shocking, right? There's stuff in there where you're like, oh my God. And and there can be systemic, decade-long failures that lead up to this point. But without an inspectorate, how do we identify that? Like, schools can just kind of go for years and years and years without anyone pointing that out. So yeah, I don't know. I am pro inspectorate, but I'm also very pro reform. So
in terms of any unforeseen consequences potentially hiding among the changes they've mentioned, the one that I think they just haven't necessarily said a lot on yet that I'd like to know more of is that there was initially this sort of indication that they want to move away from the previous framework's focus on curriculum, which, as Adam was talking about earlier, like, I agree, I think has been instrumental in raising outcomes sort of nationally. And I think they were talking about how the new framework would have more of a focus on outcomes alongside sort of other measures and so on. And I just want to know whether that's going to be, I mean, the concern there is that does that lead back to it being more data focused, and like, if a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure and we're back where we were before. But then I think in the most recent sort of communication that with all of these 12 changes, Martin Oliver did say that he wants to avoid sort of change for change's sake, and that some elements of the framework will be kept, such as curriculum and early reading. So I'd want to know more about that, but that's one area that I'd potentially be wary of. And I guess the inspections, the call coming on Monday, somebody made a good point. I don't know if it was on Blue Sky or Twitter, but about would schools move like music, computing, MFL to the Thursday and Friday, like a day when they're not necessarily going to be inspected. There's always things that will be done to navigate the inspection process, and regardless of what they bring out, there'll be different ways that schools go about it.
I wonder if the Tuesday, Wednesday inspection routine will go when they when they change the framework, and they'll be able to say, yeah, inspections are less stressful anyway, and they'll go back to having midweek or end of week inspections. I think it's been pitched as just a temporary measure. There was that I did have it up on my computer. I can't find it now, but there's that timeline that Tez put out where it was like, this is changing and that's changing. And it seemed to sort of imply that it might be temporary. I think it's a good thing they announced it when they did, rather than back in August or July, because if you were really unscrupulous, like trust, primary director, you'd be looking at your part-time staff, or you'd be looking at kind of split classes and saying, well, maybe Mr. X should only be working Thursday and Friday in this class, that this school, where you think that an inspection is possible. The people are always going to game the system. It's impossible to have an ungame system. So if you're looking at outcomes, I think that Ofsted need to go into it trying to reduce as much as possible those unintended consequences. But then we know that Ofsted are conscious of it because they always publish these MIFS documents. So you have to think that a lot of thought goes into that process to try and avoid that. I think curriculum will maintain its status, not only because it has a certain amount of momentum behind it, at the moment, but also because of the curriculum review with, I can't remember if it's Becky Francis or Becky Allen.
Yeah, Becky Francis.
Becky Francis, that's it. With Becky Francis, I think that will keep curriculum in the forefront, and changes to the national curriculum will keep everyone on their toes for the next decade. So yeah, it's I think I would have been worried if we'd got a brand new framework with like lots of oracy and skills and employment stuff in it. But I have to say, I don't think this is probably the better end of the spectrum in terms of what I was expecting on Ofsted reform. So it was incremental, gradual, right? I mean, it's fairly gradual, isn't it? It's not big bang abolition, and it's not, we're going to keep everything the same for a year.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's not knee jerk, is it?
No, although the getting rid of one word grades, again, people will have so much goodwill for Labour because it is quite a, not knee jerk, but it's quite what's the word I'm looking for? A bit of a stunt, right? It's not, there's not really a meaningful change there. People have given it a lot of headline. I mean, not just headline in terms of Tes and Schools Week, but BBC News. I was listening to the Times Red Box podcast with just the worst columnists, pontificating on Ofsted, knowing basically nothing about it. But it's all been quite positive press. Whereas I can imagine kind of if the previous government had moved a bit quicker, they might have decided to do the same thing, get rid of one word judgments, and we'd all be sitting around saying, yeah, well, they haven't fundamentally changed the system, nothing's going to change, it's exactly the same, this is just a stunt, this is typical of the Tories, which you can understand why people feel like that. But I do think that's an important lens to look at these kind of political decisions through, is what would it be, how would it be received if the other side were doing it?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked a number of times in the podcast about how I envisage this world where, and I know that people smarter than me will say that education should be inherently political, but I imagine it's almost separate, and you get to see what things look like over a really extended period of time. And so we've been moving the curriculum incrementally on since, 2012 is the draft, but really 2010 when the coalition government came in. And we could potentially have another 10, 15 years. I don't know. It depends when that goodwill is going to burn out and whether or not things actually happen before 2029. But we could see an extended period of time where curriculum is developed, and that's almost my dream, is where we get a chance to do things rather than just keep shifting the goalposts all the time. So I'm quite optimistic about that.
We're, as a trust, we were quite a leader on curriculum stuff, early on, and we're now, I would say, on like our third iteration of our primary curriculum, and we're now starting to really, things are starting to gel. And I was talking to primary teachers, and the messaging that we're giving is more nuanced, and the balance that we're getting between complete adherence to a trust curriculum and teacher autonomy is much more nuanced than it has been in the past. And we're allowing teachers, well, not even allowing, but we're sort of encouraging more autonomy from teachers. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It's actually a really nice period of time to allow things to bed in.
I mean, I'm really interested, Adam, in your thoughts on abolition and reform, because I'm with you. I think some sort of accountability measure is necessary. What would have you thought much about what your ideal incarnation of Ofsted or some sort of inspectorate might look like?
Yeah, quite a lot. I mean, there was an article in TES, which again I can't read, and it was the guy who's running Ofsted Academy. So they're like training arm. I don't really understand what this is. He said inspections will always be high stakes, and I have to say I agree with that. I agree with the idea that essentially schools are multi-million-pound public institutions. They receive public funding. They do, and we have to believe they do an unbelievably important job, right? If we're going to be teachers, and to fail at that job has huge consequences for the most vulnerable people in our society at the most vulnerable point in their life. I just can't emphasize enough how important good schools are, and we know that. So to not have a central government body which is responsible for accountability there for the money for the task that schools have just doesn't sit well. I don't think that I think that if you can imagine an alternate world in which we have these kind of like what the Ofsted abolitionists call for, of kind of schools supporting schools and local authorities doing things and everyone holding hands and, I don't know, wishing everything was better. Like there'd be a massive underlying scandal somewhere there, wouldn't there? There'd be some group of schools that sweeps under the carpet some hideous safeguarding thing, or schools in some part of the country, like, just, I can imagine it like making widening a lot of regional inequality, or inequality between different areas in the same town. Like, in a way, Ofsted is the great leveler, right? Or it should be. I mean, we know from the research that it's not always, it quite often isn't the great leveler that it should be. A good Ofsted should be. So I guess that would be a starting point for me. It would be, how do we develop a framework that I think it would have to be, my ideal framework would have to be quite outcomes focused. I'm really fixated on the expected standard, as I said earlier, and I think that is a good milepost. I think Elliot talking earlier about these annual safeguarding reviews, they are just like, I can't believe we haven't separated out from Ofsted, and I can't believe that annual safeguarding reviews haven't just been a thing since like 1995. Like, it just baffles me. Well, that's not already the case. It's just odd. It's like suddenly someone had the idea that we should have a police force, or that we should, like, have security at the airport. Well, okay, seems so obvious that we need to have that. And I guess I think that Ofsted should be quite a technical overview of a school, not keen on the judgments on pedagogy, or even massively keen on things like judgments about, when you read reports and they're talking about children at a school say they love coming here, or children at this school, like culture stuff, like that is so important. We know it's important, but ultimately I think that should be the concern of the trust and the community and the stakeholders, not for external judgment, because also how much of swing of that can you get in like 2 days? So I would have an inspectorate. They would be producing pretty technical reports, and it would be quite data focused, I think, and it would be quite focused on assessments and outcomes, and like a separate annual safeguarding review. And I think that I don't really care if it's a report card or not. There's actually a really interesting, who was it? Was it Askell, I think, published this incredible report into report cards and what they're called and all these different types of report cards that institutions use, and there's this management theory behind it. So you can go and read that if that's your bag. Maybe that'll be what you're reading for in the future. But I don't really care on that side of things. I think that accountability measures are absolutely non-negotiable if we're going to run a public school system. So yeah,
I agree with a lot of the things that Adam said, but I just, in just one sentence, like, you simply cannot have schools without accountability. Like, it would just be the Wild West. And like, your mind cannot help but go to safeguarding. Just imagine if safeguarding were not being inspected regularly. That is an incredibly worrying proposition. So yeah, I agree that schools, like Ofsted, is, and to phrase it diplomatically, perhaps some people might say a necessary evil, but can also, it's a force for good. It can be a force for good, and these changes that they're proposing are certainly more leaning towards the force for good in my eyes. But we'll see. What are your thoughts, Kieran?
Yeah, I mean, I just want us, whatever system we have in place, I want it to take account of what it is possible to measure, what's, based on sensible interpretations of data, because I don't think we always get that. For instance, ask Richard Selfridge to be the person who outlines what data is going to be measured and how, and it's going to be reported on, et cetera, and you're going to get a pretty sensible approach, and so what I just want it to be based on the very best that we know about what's measurable, what's observable, and what we can accurately describe. Like you say, Adam, a really technical description of what's happening in schools. And I think when we remove some of the I don't know if they're biases or if they're like they potentially are cognitive biases, that sort of overshadow the ways we think, because lots of things we do in schools we do because we've always done them. And I think taking 5 years and really outlining what's possible, like Robco did with his poor proxies for learning. Well, I think we need poor proxies for inspection, and then that acts as the starting point. And then if we build on that foundation, then I think we bring parity of experience to everyone, because then that means that schools in Norfolk are getting measured with the same expectations as schools in I don't know, Windsor or somewhere, where perhaps opportunities in greater abundance. And so yes, that would be so what it physically looks like, I'm not sure, but I think there are a lot of assumptions that we could remove, and I think it's a 5-10 year job.
I wonder whether we've reached peaked three white men on a podcast now, because we're like, if only it was more technical and objective, if only we could just apply the objective data and scientific method to school inspection and take away the biases, these bloody pesky biases. If only we could get rid of them, then we'd have a perfect inspectorate. We could just plug a USB drive into every school that we visit. We'd be able to perfectly measure. I just sat here having this moment of clarity where I was like, oh my God, we're just three white middle-aged men who love data and think that it's the solution to, I don't know. Yeah, I'm starting to question myself now whether I still agree with what I just said. I just think it's just really like perfectly illustrates kind of how people view education through certain lenses, don't they? Because you can imagine three different people would have such a wildly different answer to the question of like, what is Ofsted for? Like, and that is fundamentally the difficulty that the government is going to face, because we've all sounded like we've come to some kind of consensus there, but it's a very consensus in the corner, isn't it? It's sort of like, it's not a consensus that I think holds out in the wider community. So it'd be interesting hearing some people's comments on that, because I'm sure people are sat there listening in their cars thinking, oh, this is not, this would be terrible for all these incredibly valid reasons.
And one of the things that I mentioned earlier on about Blue Sky, about being able to access more teachers and their thoughts, I mean, I think this is only the second time we've directly had an episode that focused on Ofsted, and I think over the next 12 months, over the next academic year, perhaps trying to sample those thoughts from a range of teachers who perhaps were, you know, we weren't seeing their message, but really actively seeking them. I think that might be the way forward.
Well,
Because
I'll come back and do a debrief when we've had our Ofsted, and maybe we can gather together some people who've also recently had Ofsteds and talk about what we would have changed and kind of what that process was like. I'd like to hear from some heads from that perspective.
yeah, I think that sounds great because all we've really done is poke around the edges. We find a mildly interesting development in our place of work or in our field, and we haven't really gone into any massive depth on as you say. So yeah, so I think it's a fantastic idea and definitely something to explore as we move forward. And I've enjoyed it. Hopefully, at least a small portion of the listeners have enjoyed it too.
Hopefully, what's the figure? 55%.
Yeah. So, what I'm really hoping is that we don't get any heckling at research aid from anyone who's listened to this at 5 a.m.
We'll all be in each other's. I'll do the heckling for you. Yeah.
All that's left to do is say thank you very much for joining me. Thank you very much, Adam.
Thank you. See you on Saturday.
Thank you very much, Elliot.
Thank you. See you on Saturday, boys.
And to everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.